My name is Lisa Koenigsberg, and I'm the president of Initiatives in Art and Culture. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to this, I guess, final session of the morning. And the topic that we're going to take on is the meaning of origin in the colored gemstone trade. Now, one of the things that those of us who live within a Cibjo ecosystem understand is that every word is open to debate. So I will say that origin is not the only word that may come up for discussion, but that I definitely should come up for discussion. So I'm joined this morning by, and this is an order of listing of panelists. It is not alphabetical, and I apologize. Sara Yood, who is CEO and General Counsel of the Jewelers Vigilance Committee. Tiffany Stevens, who is a Chief Business Officer and Head of Sustainability at the International Gemological Institute in the United States. Edward Johnson, who is Corporate Responsibility Director of the Gemfields Group. On the screen, our dear friend Adriano Moll, who is wearing two hats. He is the head of the Center for Gemstone and Jewelry Design at the University of Minas Gerais, and he is also the head of brand and product development for Cruziero mine, which is a tourmaline mine in Brazil, for those of you that don't know. And then Kenneth Scarratt, who is the president of Cibjo Sector A, parens Gem Materials. And it's a wonderful panel. This is a topic that will not only fill today, but will fill many sessions. So it seemed that there, if you will, were four topics or four subheadings for this question, for this discussion. And I'm going to plunge into the first one, but it's going to be a quick dive. Because the question I wanted to raise is that of spectrum. So what is the spectrum of colored stones that we're talking about? When we talk about colored stones, that seems to be undergoing a broadening, if you will. But I was wondering, Ken, how and why did origin determination become an important element for certain rubies, sapphires, and emeralds? And why is this, if you will, sales element now reaching into other gem species?
Do we have 3 hours or 5 minutes? It's a very big and searching question. Let me just begin very simply from my historical knowledge. There was a gentleman called Dr. Edward Gubelin, who I think most of us are very much aware of. And in the 60s and 70s, that's the 1960s and 70s, not the 1860s and 70s, he was pretty famous. He was famous for a lot of things, but one of the things he was really famous for, apart from his great knowledge of gemstones, was his amazing ability to write. He could write like nobody else. And I don't think anybody of this generation can write like him. It was beautifully flowery, it was wonderful. And there was a period during that time when people would come to him with a beautiful stone and say, I was going to say Edward, and they wouldn't. They would say, please, doctor. And I say, can you look at this and write something about it? And he could do it in such a wonderful way on one side of A4 that nobody else could do. And he was Swiss, but there are very few British people could write the way that he could write. It was just in English. It was amazingly good. But he'd write this wonderfully flowery letter about the material, and at the end of it, he would say, and this beautiful ruby comes from Mogok in Burma. And this went on for a while. And the popularity rose. It came from there. And what it was marketing. It wasn't really about, the origin at all. People wanted Edward's name, his flowery letter, and the Mogok signal at the end of the letter. And that eventually, I would say, through the late 70s, 80s, into the 90s, evolved into gemological laboratories who were expanding during that period in introducing origin determinations on their reports. Now, none of those laboratories could write the way that Edward Googling could write. So basically, they were very clinical reports, but saying very clearly the origin. That developed after a little while when people realized that they weren't necessarily factual, they were more opinions. And so then we saw the new wording of this is an origin opinion, not a fact. So I'm going to cut there, let everybody else just jump in. But basically, that's the way the whole thing developed. Can I add one more thing?
Yes, sure, please.
Which I think is an important one. There are those amongst us, gemologists, who treat origin in a very different manner. Not in the terms of marketing, but in terms of trying to understand the material itself. So we as gemologists, over the last decade or two, have developed amazing systems to learn more about the material itself. And as a result of that, we've become a little more accurate in the way that we can state an origin. But it is not accurate in everything. And I was saying to my friends last couple of days, if you give me an emerald, I can probably give you an origin pretty well, because we have a whole bunch of trace elements to look at. You give me a ruby, and it's not bad either if it's from certain locations. But give me a blue sapphire, and I've always got a headache. So it's an ongoing process, a learning process. And I enjoy it from a scientific perspective. But I also understand that the people out in the big wide world are not looking at it in the same way. They're looking at it as a marketing tool. And that's where I'll finish for the moment.
Well, I venture where angels fear to tread, because you've prompted me to ask a question before going on to the remainder of the panelists, and that is, what about the reconciliation of such things as documentation that accompanies a stone from a particular mine, and the reconciliation between, or the incorporation of that kind of documentary evidence, for example, such as you might be getting from Gemfields or on behalf of Cruziero, with the laboratory approach? Are they each in the realm of studied opinion, or?
It's a really good question, and if we take Gemfields and the Brazilian mining scenarios, where you have a lot of control over the product coming out, and you're able to have that paper trail going forward, that's wonderful. I mean, that's a great advantage we have in stating gemstone origins. But as some as most of my gemological friends would immediately say would be, if that same stone now is brought into a lab to have a gemological report, and the owner said, well, this is from Gemfields, or this is from a mine in Brazil I know about. The response in a lab is, oh, that's very interesting. That's it. Because it doesn't go beyond that. Because the lab has to sit down and work it out. without any bias from a client bringing a stone in. Basically, and this is no reflection on Gemfields or anybody else, we have a culture built in gemological laboratories around the world. You cannot believe what you're told. You have to have factual evidence to back it up. And so, yes, thank you. Okay, Gemfields, oh, it's wonderful. Congratulations. But then it goes behind the door and we have to do our work.
So, Adriano, welcome. And I'm wondering, in questions of determination of origin, methods, if you will, would you maintain that local community engagement in environmental stewardship or mining practices specifically play a role in impacting determination of origin? What factors, from your perspective, come to bear in this discussion?
Hi, Lisa. Hi, everyone. Let's join from abroad. So, we have a framework of community engagement, environmental standards in the food and wine industry. That is the denomination of controlled origin. So, can you hear me well?
Metza. Excuse me, sir. Please keep talking. I'm just going to go see if I can get someone. Pardon me, everybody.
Okay. So, this denomination of origins, those proven effective methods,
from this.
they combine geographic characteristics, local expertise of the production communities. So this can define the quality and authenticity of such a product. So in a way, the origins to the nature of the product that's very interesting, tied together with the gemological assessment done by the lab.
Just go with it. Yeah.
And this will come up with a better product proposal.
Excuse me for having stepped away. Ed, is there anything you'd like to add with respect to Adriano's comments?
Slightly challenging, since I didn't hear much of them. But I anticipate that Adriano was talking about the importance as a responsible miner, as Cruziero does, about the work that they would be putting in around community engagement and environmental stewardship, and following strong principles that add to the value of the stones in terms of the positive impact that the stones make in the countries where they come from. So I have...
But, excuse me, I see that as a slightly different question.
Sorry, you asked me to add, so I was just going to do that.
Well, unfortunately, I had stepped away because one of the parts of the question was how, for example, might mining practices, if you will, add to determination of origin? And so what I'm wondering is, and I'll just, forgive me, Adriano, I'm just going to create this question and ask you, which is, for example, the Gemfields mining of ruby and mining of emerald, are there practices, are there ways of extracting the stone, or are there characteristics of the stone that are so tied to your particular, not only location, but mine, that they become signature elements? Or is there some practice that is used? In other words, very situation specific. You look puzzled, we can skip that.
I'm trying to interpret the question.
Okay. Well, I'm going to sum up the first two sessions, the first two questions, which is, I think Ken laid out a very interesting paradigm, which we're about to challenge. And in this conversation, one of the things that I was in a backhanded way getting at is that we are talking about colored stones broadly defined. So that would include tourmalines, emeralds, rubies, etc., the full spectrum. And that is sometimes not the case, but in this instance, we are taking that term very broadly, and we have with us a representation, if you will, from what one could say is a larger scale mining approach, as well as a smaller scale mining approach in the case of Cruziero. So we're going to go straight to the meaning of origin. And, good God, Ken, question for you. What has happened with regard to the elements that were previously at the center of discussion of origin and colored stones? Yep. What has happened with regard to the elements that were previously or that have been at the center of the discussion of origin and colored stones?
Okay. Initially, when people were most interested in there's a terrible noise in the background. I'm not sure what it is.
Yes, there is.
When people were really interested in origins, they were only interested in the big three, basically. It was to the big three that we did most of the research and developing processes. But since then, there have been the instances are too numerous to list out here today. But it has gone, for example, like Paraíba tourmaline. Everybody wants to know the origin of Paraíba tourmaline. Is it Brazilian or is it from somewhere else? But it goes further than that. I mean, in my lab experience, I've had people bring in amethyst. And so I was, well, you know, where does it come from? You know, asking impossible questions like that. And, it goes across the board. So every gemstone that you can think of, people are asking or wanting that extra bit of information, I won't even call it information, that extra marketing ploy, as I would call it, to push their stone forward. Whatever that is. There's a garnet. Doesn't matter, everything. So that's how things are changing. And it's reflection of, as I said earlier, how it all originated, origin determination. And that is through a desire for that extra marketing tick that would sell the stone.
Well, Ed, I'm going to circle around to Sara so she can bring us into G7. What has happened, Ed, why is it increasingly important to consider the mine of origin as opposed to just country of origin? And what accounts for the shift toward, if you will, this digging down? And also, I'm going to throw in something from Ken that was prompted by Ken's question. Is more specific determination of origin or assignment of origin, to defer to the question of whether it's a fact, is that always about marketing, of sales, or are there other issues to be taken into that are being referenced by that specificity?
The shift has come about in the past 20 years, where there is much more definition that's needed about the origin of colored stones, principally because of requests from consumers, and principally because of more challenges, economic, social, and political challenges in certain countries where consumers want to make sure that their purchases in the jewelry retail stores are not part of a supply chain that's creating negative impacts. So it's It is something to do with marketing, and here Ken and I agree and yet disagree. I would suggest that if I'm wearing a Gemfields hat, and Gemfields was founded over 20 years ago to improve the colored gemstone supply chain by bringing large-scale mining practices to initially one mine, Kagem Emerald Mine in Zambia, and then secondly, the Montepuez Ruby Mine in Mozambique, and to be able to bring full traceability of large-scale production of colored stones, thus enabling the market to prosper because you're bringing economies of scale and large amounts of quantity and quality. So with us, it's in our DNA that the point of mining is to bring the product from a country and to maximize the value of that product, so you maximize the return to the host country. The value of the gemstone principally stays within the country. So the return to Mozambique and Zambia is greater than it had done previously. So I would say that's not about marketing, that is about improving everybody's decision that gemstones can make a positive impact in the countries in which they come from, because more value stays there. All right. Obviously, we use it for marketing because the consumer wishes to see that more value is being brought back to communities around the world that deserve it. And certainly nobody can dispute, in our opinion, and I think in most people's opinion, that the mineral resources in a country belong to the residents and citizens of that country. So that, from my perspective, is where I sit with the origin. If I can address, you had a few questions within the one, but one, you talked about why it's important to differentiate between mine of origin and country of origin. Absolutely, Ken is correct, and I love the historical story about Dr. Gubelin and his prose. And obviously that developed into the laboratories being able to offer services to determine origin, and that was based on geographic and geological conditions which dictated the country. Now, obviously we operate, and Gemfields strives on a continual basis to operate responsibly, as Cruziero and Adriana was talking to us about, with environmental stewardship, adherence to human rights principles, and a strong adherence to creating a positive impact. Now, we can see that the reduction in negative impacts that mining can cause and the increase in positive impacts that we have as a mine are different to what perhaps a neighboring mine to us creates. So the impact of the mine, in our case Gemfields Kagem or Gemfields MRM, is significantly different to another Mozambique ruby or a Zambian emerald. So that is the critical point where we feel quite clearly that the industry needs to shift from a country of origin model to requesting information on the mine of origin. So then they can determine and measure the impact that that particular source or origin has made.
I'm going to take a detour here and go to Sara, because one of the things that we are sort of dancing around a bit is we're not talking about diamonds unless they're colored diamonds, but it's a good model, and that is talking about the purpose of identification of origin. And I wondered if you'd like, particularly in light of global circumstances or geopolitical forces, as Ed called them, to comment on that.
Certainly. I think that the discussion of origin with colored gemstones really differs from that which we've had of diamonds in the past, simply because for so long, as Ken pointed out, and that origin added to the value of a colored gemstone in a way that it really didn't with diamonds for a very long time. The value of the diamond supply chain for so long has been in aggregation and in the sort and allotment of diamonds that you could produce in standardized formats and shapes and sizes and colors, and that's really been a different it's really different than the way color gemstones have been marketed. And so especially, we see that changing now, though, because of Russia's war in Ukraine, because of the G7 efforts to ensure that undisclosed or disclosed Russian diamonds don't enter the supply chains of these other countries, and our financial systems are not used to support the war in Ukraine. Origin information is becoming far more important with diamonds than it used to before. So I think it's actually quite interesting to take some lessons from what has happened with colored gemstones, because we can see that the value of origin is really important, but also, as Ed rightfully pointed out, that the mine and the supplier itself is incredibly important. And so we don't want consumers to hear one bad story and extrapolate that to every single point of origin in a country, or one good story and then risk, sort of blanketing everything else with that halo effect.
Adriano, I'm wondering if you could talk to us a bit about Brazil's specific mining practices, regulations, and traceability of gemstones. How, for example, that has been involved in shifting the perception of origin and its assignation, if you will, or the way we've shifted in thinking about it.
Wonderful. I hope you can hear me better now.
Yes, splendid.
Excellent. So getting back to the core thing, which is the origin, Brazil has been a source of gemstones ever since 1700s, when our diamonds and gems discovered here revolutionized the world jewelry. That was known in Portugal as the Feast of Color. Yet some of these sources are not credited to this day. Despite this wealth of various materials, and that gets back to your question about spectrum, I think all gems should be credited of the origin. The most evident case is the Paraíba denomination. It's globally recognized, yet it's not tied to a specific determination of origin, as Ken beautifully put. So I think in the case of Brazil, making a case of Brazil, our contributions, they tend to be overshadowed by the entire African continent. So I wish I had more the origin of gems from Brazil better recognized. We needed better crediting for Brazilian contributions for the mining. That's critical to understanding the origin instead of just like the country of origin or the specific mine of origin. So in Brazil today, we have not one, but two prime examples. We have arguably the most sophisticated emerald mine in the world. That's Belmont, the pioneer in optical sorting. And of course, the legendary Cruziero mine is being operating 100% locally owned and operated for 85 years also. And that's an example, a prime example of non-predatory approach to mining. Over there in the mine, we aim at full transparency. We had a couple of you visiting us there. It was beautiful visits by Tiffany and by Lisa. So we want to put it out in the world. We have our collaborations with IAC and IGI for branded certificates, and we want to show it all. So I hope to see more mines in Brazil take on this sustainable and innovative practices that will ensure our strong mineral wealth is recognized and celebrated as a cornerstone of the global gemstone industry, as it is.
So, Tiffany, a perfect follow-on. You are representing IGI, and one of the lab on this panel, and one of the things I'm wondering, both generally and specifically, how reports produced by institutions such as IGI reflect the shift to that is traceability and responsible sourcing, if you will, as was suggested by Ed and Adriano. And in specific, how might the work you're doing with Cruziero exemplify that?
Thank you. So just to set the table a little bit, I think it's really worthwhile to throw the spotlight onto colored gemstones more broadly because of the exploding growth of the sector in popularity with consumers. So it's projected that there'll be a compound annualized growth rate of colored gemstones between 2023 and 2033 of about 10%, which is, billions of dollars. And so we see the colored gemstone sector as being incredibly important on its own from within the lab and to consumers, and also as an interesting hedge against the volatility of diamonds, both natural and lab grown, from a narrative perspective and a financial perspective. So I just want to give a lot of respect to colored gemstones, and I love color, and that we think it's a very, very, very important part of the sector.
Just to jump in, one of the things that has been interesting to me is diamond companies are embracing color as adding something to their lines. So Lugano is one that does it, for example, and that too may add some steam to what you're speaking of.
Absolutely. But I think one of the challenges, origin is obviously a core challenge, and one that we have to, as a lab, have to take very seriously. We have to get it right. That's the whole point of why we exist, is to get things right. But, when you think about grading a diamond versus grading a colored gemstone, it's a lot like the difference between math and poetry. And I think Ken's initial point really illuminates that. And I think that there's no reason to hide from that, and that we have to lean into it and accept these differences while also taking very seriously our obligation to get it right. And I see within the lab, it's an iterative process, as has been mentioned. It's something that gemologists are learning more and more about every day, and it's something that we really try not to overreach. As much as we might get excited about something, we never want to overreach, because we both have the interest from some of our clients to use these terms as marketing tools, but as Sara well knows, we also have the stick of sanctions, making sure that we're not letting anything pass through our lab that shouldn't be getting graded in the United States with various sanctions schemes that are going on. When we think about traceability, specifically to your question, we do have a really wonderful partnership with Cruziero, and I've been incredibly lucky to actually go visit and to climb down into the mine, and that was a wonderful highlight life experience. I know you've had it too. And so the way that we've been doing it, we have a special co-branded relationship with them, and because we're able to work so closely together, it's very manual, honestly, and it's basically like a chain of custody where we have processes between the two of us where things are coming directly from the mine into our vault and then moving on to a designer or a brand or whatever. And we know that it's from Cruziero because we have the sort of documentary evidence and all the sort of systems that we've put into place. So that's the way that the partnership works as of today. We are, and I think you've learned a little bit about this too, moving towards a possible launch of having a more technologically robust traceability system that we will pilot, we think, with Cruziero in the coming months. And then we'd like to use that as a blueprint for some of the other relationships with source countries, smaller producers, medium-sized producers in source countries, to add that level of robustness to the sort of very artisanal type of relationship that we're developing there. I hope that answers your question.
So we've sort of arrived at this point in the conversation that we're talking about a full spectrum of colored stones, that there is a shift for varied reasons in what one might say is determination of origin in the meaning, and for various purposes, and yet at the same time, the challenge that something is an opinion. So I'd like to go back to that original thought and ask you, Ken, what is the role of consuming countries in creating this broadened, I don't want to say definition because it might offend you, but concept, shall we say, this broadened concept of origin? And are there market benefits to the gemstone community?
Yeah, that is a pretty broad question again. I'm not sure that the consumer countries at this time have a strong opinion on this subject matter. However, having said that, I also believe, and I think I speak to Tiffany as well as this wonderful partnership you have going here. There has been, and we have to address this, there has been and continues to be a potential consumer confidence, in fact, trade confidence crisis in origin determinations. If you look at, I wouldn't say any Christie's catalog or any Sotheby's catalog, but at least some of them over the last several years, you will find important stones being marketed through those scenarios where you have one stone that has been given 3 different origins from 3 different labs. And I'm not talking about mom and pop labs around the world. I'm talking about high reputation labs around the world that are giving 3 different origin opinions. This is very challenging. For me, I had a big discussion about this at the last Cibjo Congress in China. And we had big arguments about it. Some people felt, oh, that's okay. It doesn't matter. You pay your money and make your choice. But from a gemologist perspective, it's a headache. And anyone in the public that looked at that, they would have a real crisis of confidence in the lab, and through the lab, the trade. So we've been working closely with the Gemological Commission within Cibjo to try to drive that forward into something positive and encourage labs to work together to get this right. Now, one of the tragedies of all of this is in order to get that right, you need a reference base, like you're building here, that you can refer to constantly for the next 300 years. So you need material from the mines, every single mine. You need it stored, cataloged into a into a bank, so that as instrumentation, and this is important, as instrumentation gets better, and we can get more real information out of the material, we can keep going back to that stock and developing criteria that will give us great origins. Now I'm thinking, of course, from my historic situation within the lab and providing services to clients, but it also applies to what you're talking about, what everyone's talking about. If the EU or the US decides that a certain material from a certain location is de rigueur, they don't want it in their country, we need to have that much better information. And I'm sad to say there are very few labs around the world that have that data bank. And the Gemological Commission of Cibjo is now trying to work very hard to make that that problem go away. I don't think it's going to be in my lifetime, unfortunately. But we have to acknowledge that that's the problem. And if we're talking about origin, and we said earlier they moved to this opinion. Well, I can give an opinion about anything, whether it's the color of my shoes or whether it's your haircut, sir. I can give a lot of opinions about things. We need facts.
So in line with that, Tiff, I'm wondering, how does the potential use of more sophisticated equipment by third parties, does that have market implications? And is there a potential downside in that for smaller producers? So I wonder, and how might a third-party entity rectify kind of differentials between what you can get from a larger scale mine and a smaller scale enterprise?
Certainly. Certainly, there are, we're trying to mitigate that difference already with our partnership with Cruziero and using it as a blueprint for other partnerships with small and medium-sized producers. I think in the marketplace, if you think about traceability with fashion, I've been lucky to be part of some of the different conversations on traceability, more broadly throughout fashion and luxury. And there is actual technology that can be attached to threads within fiber. So, so you could have a piece of clothing that is literally like a t-shirt that's traceable. But so consumers out there making that decision, and then they're going to spend $5,000, $10,000, $25,000 more, and we can't tell them where it comes from. It's just a very, I think, real problem for us. And if, demographics are destiny, the under 40 crowd is getting older every day, and they're maturing with these assumptions that they're going to be able to know where the things they're buying are coming from, so they can then make their own, moral or whatever type of decision that they want to make about it. So just to underscore the importance of it, but also to acknowledge the real challenge that we have, because just as Ken said, I think in our lab, we don't, the gemologists are constantly talking about wanting to just have a larger library and database and something to base all of this on. And the history between the labs has not been super collaborative. And so we're each working, trying to build our own knowledge base in real time often. And then things change and we have to iterate. So we're in a very challenging moment of wanting to give the consumers full transparency about things, but also not wanting to be wrong about it or to be self-conflicting about it by giving one opinion and then someone else is giving another opinion. So I think in the meantime, we keep working on it and we make sure that we're not leaving out smaller producers and that we do as much as we possibly can, whether that's manually or with robust technology, to make sure that we're bringing the small and medium-sized producers right along with us, and also working with larger producers and making sure that we're leveraging all of the great knowledge that they have about their own product, and that's coming through to all the labs and eventually as many consumers as possible.
So, Adriano, building on Tiffany's answer, I wonder, I have known Cruziero for some time, and origin has always been a key question, and demonstration of origin. So what I'm wondering is, how do the key differences in how origin is determined and verified across gem-producing regions, yours, for example, impact the international market? What do you think is the impact of understanding origin and different perceptions of origin on the market from your perspective?
Lisa, this question of yours makes me remind me when I was in my 20s. I was a gemstone seller, and people asked me all the time when I was doing shows, like in the Tucson show, they asked where this stone come from. I got mad at it back then. And I didn't understand why they were asking this, why they don't look just at the quality of the stones. So 30 years from it, just like Tiffany was saying, our perception evolved. So people want to know about the origin. People want to be informed of the whole producing chain of the product. So like Ken said, the technology is evolving and evolving, and I believe there will be a time when it will answer all needs of origin certification. So that we'll be able to tie the best products to the best origins, and I think that's the only way forward.
Can I add something?
I was just about to ask you.
I was reflecting on Adriano's thought as a gemstone dealer about the annoyance of being asked where it come from instead of the appeal of the stone. And I completely understand and agree with that. You know, a Burmese ruby is perceived to be more valuable, but you have low quality Burmese rubies and very high quality rubies from Burma. So I want to reflect on when I studied my gemology, way back when I had hair. One of the first lessons that I learned in selling colored gemstones is to romance the stone, to give the information that the customer wants to hear, and this is marketing, all right, which is accurate. And the classic example in terms of romancing the stone is tanzanite. You know, when it was first discovered, Tanzania was an extremely exotic country to American consumers. Hence why Henry Platt, the boss of Tiffany, named it tanzanite instead of blue zoisite. All right, there's other reasons, obviously he chose that name, but one of the points is to romance the location from whence it came. All right? Now that wasn't about the positive or negative impacts of mining in Tanzania. It was to take the consumer on a journey of discovery to far-off lands that they couldn't possibly experience, but they could own a little piece of it, a tiny crystal from it, that also happened to be extremely beautiful. And I think we can't get away from that in the color gemstone business. We mine in extremely varied and exotic locations. You know, I spent a lot of time in Mozambique and a lot of time in Zambia. It's not a normal workplace for most people, okay? And I'm extremely privileged to be there, and the beauty of the country and the resilience of the people. And that's what we should be worshipping. The countries from whence they come. I want to preface that with the mine of origin, as I've talked about, because I think that's critical going forward. It's also kind of my day job to promote that, so I do. But we do have to talk about origin as a sales technique, because it takes people to the far-off beautiful places where the stones come from.
Can I add one more thing? So, you know, no surprise coming from me representing IGI. One thing we're really excited about is just encouraging people to send more colored gemstones to get graded. You know, certainly the like extremely elite, most beautiful, most special things in the world are going to be put under the microscope, but we really want to make sure that people see colored gemstones generally as worthwhile of being examined, so we can start build our knowledge and make sure that our gemologists are getting to see lots of different things, and we're employing lots of different folks who specialize in color, and we can keep the lineage of knowledge going and growing. And so we're really reaching out. We have a long history of colored gemstone expertise, and I'm going to try to make sure that more dealers and more consumers are sending in their stones to learn more about what they are and help us learn more about what they are.
Adriano, I wonder what your thinking is about the broadening of the material that we're considering, because this is something to which you spoke, that we've sort of gone from what was termed the big three to a much more expanded vocabulary. And what is the impact of that on barriers to market entry?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think I'm going to redirect that to Edward.
Punting.
Oh, no question. I think he will answer much better than me.
Okay, well, your perspective is quite unique. Ed, I've got another one just for you, actually, unless you prefer that one.
Repeat the question if you wouldn't mind, and then I will definitely take it. If he can't take it, I'll try.
Okay, so the essence of the question was, what's the impact of broadened material being considered, so more a broader vocabulary of stones, if you will, and the relationship to barriers to market entry? So,
Would you mind rephrasing that in some way?
you know what? It's actually really odd.
Oh,
Yeah, please.
Ken, if you've got...
Now, can I turn it on its head?
Of course.
Because I think it's a great question, but it's going from a different direction. The big issue here with so many other gemstones, so I'm using the word requiring origin information, is that the labs are not big enough. We don't have enough data. If you ask us to keep doing this, it's going to be guesswork, guesswork, guesswork. I mean, I don't know how many great gemologists you got working in your lab, but they're working identifying stones. How many researchers do you have dedicated to all this? How many samples do you have? What equipment do you have? What's your budget? Which is probably even more so. So having all of these things coming in, forget about the industry itself requiring it, the labs can't cope.
And there's no business model for it as well. The cost and value of the material is below the value and cost of the testing to determine the gemological origin. So, and you talked about amethyst, Ken. It's a great example. Traditionally, origin determination on gemological reports was done with the highest value gemstones, ruby, sapphire, emerald. As Paraiba tourmaline came to market and prices increased, that became a business model. As spinel now is increasing in price exponentially, you can determine if it's a cobalt blue spinel from Loc Yen in Vietnam compared to the new material in Tanzania. All right, and because of the value of the gemstone. But some gemstones simply don't have a business model for gem labs.
Right, and I guess that's one of the things I was getting at, which is that in an age where certification or reports are increasingly required in order to be sold for something to be sold in the market, what is, how does that there's in effect a barrier to entry for certain stones because the market is requiring something that it is a challenge for those producers to prefer, P-R-O-F-E-R, in the market. And Adriano, I know that you have, experience of this, and I thought, the perspective of Cruziero, which has exceptional tourmalines, and I know they're part of tourmaline, but rubellites, might be something you wanted to comment on.
Yeah, I think I understand your barrier of entry question now. I think, Lisa, it's all about looking for win-win scenarios where all stakeholders, mine, corporations, community, and customers work together so they can share the value and positive impact of gemstone sourcing. So in this way, I think small producers and large corporations can help us integrate those systems with technical training, get better market access, and showcase better our transparent practices. That will assure a sustainable and ethical supply chain that will benefit everyone. Don't know if that answer is specific to the point that you wanted, but...
Ed, I see you.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of barriers of entry, I think I understand now. My apologies. So I just want to take a direct practical example from my experience. I work at the world's largest ruby mine. It mines 3 to 4 million carats of ruby a year, and it's a large-scale mine in northern Mozambique. I can drive, and have done, 2 days south, and can find a mine about the area of this podium, which feeds a village. For our customers to buy Gemfields ruby, they know 100% that it has come not just from Mozambique, but it's come from our mine, and that's the system of traceability that you have if you buy from a known producer. But then the people in that mine, 2 days south, it was a beautiful green tourmaline mine, there are barriers to entry for selling that product because people want definitive proof that it came from Mozambique. I was with somebody when they bought it, all right? I saw the resulting polished, all right? And so his trust, or the trust that the buyer has in that dealer, that he got it from Mozambique, is one thing, but then the positive impact that the value of that stone, in this case it was $10,000 for the rough, had on that community, he then needs to tell that story, okay? That is quite time consuming, but it's based on trust, which is inherent in our industry for many, many generations going back.
And if I might jump in,
Please.
I think telling that story is one of the most important parts of what we're doing here, but being truthful and specific about that story is incredibly important. In the US, we have the Federal Trade Commission that regulates interstate trade, and they have an entire set of guidelines for the jewelry industry and a separate set of what they call their green guides, which apply across industries. And one of the most important tenets in those green guides is about being specific about the environmental claims that you are making. It's shown over and over again that consumers will take an environmental claim and extrapolate it against your entire supply chain. So if you just say, you know, oh, we're eco-friendly, they're going to assume that that means so much more than maybe you intended. And so it's really important to be specific when you're talking about marketing of these types of claims about gemstones, about origin and source and traceability. All of those have to be incredibly specific. I happen to be wearing 2 rings today, one of which has a tourmaline in it. I don't know where that tourmaline is from. The other one is a spinel, and I know that that spinel was mined by a man named Anthony in Malawi at a mine. I know where the mine was. I just, purchased a gemstone where I have access to that information. I'm far more excited to talk about this one because I know I have all of that information. And I think, obviously I'm not a normal consumer of jewelry at this point. I've been in this for too long. But I think that there are consumers who are going to be so excited to hear that information, and it's our responsibility to get it to them.
It seems to me that there's actually a distinction between the meaning of origin and the uses of the meaning of origin, if you will. And Sara, one of the things I've been wondering about is we're talking about a global marketplace, and in effect, we're talking about creating a standard that is broadly applicable. And would there be challenges of aligning different regulatory environments, standards, and mining practices to be navigated?
Yeah, absolutely. Every country and, the EU, for example, everyone has their own sort of different guidelines and standards and laws, and it can often be difficult to reconcile between them. But I mentioned the green guides in the United States. They've been under review since 2022. We have not gotten there yet. And unfortunately, due to the presidential transition in the United States, I think they're going to be delayed even further. It doesn't mean that there are no standards to look to. There is an entire set of guidelines from 2012 that exist and still have force. But it does mean that in the United States, for example, we want to look to other countries for guidance on this information. And I'll just take a moment to highlight the work of the Cibjo Nomenclature Committee, which I've been serving on, which has been working to try to set some unified definitions for a lot of the terminology that we use when we're talking about jewelry and sustainability and traceability and things like that. And one of the challenges that we find, of course, on that committee is that everybody is coming from their different perspectives and their different countries. So we're trying to reconcile all that information. It's an interesting challenge to dig into, and I think that unfortunately, as we continue to see various countries segment and, work gets done at the G7 level, but then it gets done at the UN, but then it gets done at the EU, and then it gets done on a country level, it's hard to reconcile those. And so we have to try to find points of connection all around.
Yeah. So in closing, I'd like to put one question out there to all of you. Does the growing importance of social responsibility and sustainability in the colored gemstone industry indicate that consumers are increasingly valuing the ethical dimensions of gemstone origin in their purchasing? To all of you.
Lisa, if I may start, I would like to say that, like I said before, the value of a stone is not just about its physical attributes as it used to be. Now it's about also ethical and social impact. And I believe that is becoming integral to the modern definition of luxury. So it is increasingly important indeed.
Yeah, and I'll echo that as a miner. I mean, we're both in the same business, so, but I think it goes beyond the consumer requiring it. All right, we've talked extensively over this weekend about increasing legislation that's coming in that you need to have demonstrated that you're not creating a risk through a supply chain. So that's an additional driver why miners and producers of any material, gemstones or any other mineral, need to be demonstrating that they have a clear social license to operate in the countries in which they operate. All right. Yes, it's relatively new for colored gemstones. Obviously, it started with diamonds, with challenges around that led to the mechanism we know as the Kimberley process. But it's challenging to have any similar system, a cookie cutter, if you will, for colored stones. So what individual mines, Cruziero, Belmont have been mentioned, Gemfields, and many others are really doing is providing what the consumer is wanting, but also protecting themselves and their stakeholders from future risk due to incoming regulations, which we've talked about, CSDDD and CSRD. So, and those laws are driven in part by consumers, all right, but they're also driven by the general need globally that rich consuming countries can have a critical role in fixing some of the globe's greatest challenges, which in where I see it is generally poverty and inequality. So the trade and value that gemstones bring back to countries is critical in their sustainable development.
That may be, but at the same time, it may be that we are still at a point where we need to lead with those values and communicate that message, built, however, on fact as opposed to opinion, but that with regard to, if you will, the stories that are told, the narratives that relate to what the stones, for example, can do or what they represent, whilst also being mindful of the sort of greenwashing issues that Sara can speak to so well. So I'm not sure that we are at the point where it's necessarily what the consumer wants. It's not that they don't want it, it's not that we're going against it, but hopefully we are, if you will, the foam on the wave that is licking up on the shore. And we'll see more focus on that direction, be it for tourmalines in Brazil or rubies in Mozambique? Please.
I just try to be very quick on this. I agree. I think there's a growing trend in the public mind of looking for these things. But there are enormous challenges for us as an industry. And I'm just going to just mention briefly a typical challenge. How many mines are there in Mozambique? How many mines are there in Sri Lanka? I can go around the world doing this. All small mines. Most of those small mines, the product from those small mines, end up in a place called Canterbury in Thailand. And they're all mixed up. Okay? If you have your big mine, that's fine. But there are thousands upon thousands of small mines, all the product being mixed up and sold on quality, not origin, in Canterbury. So that is a huge challenge. If we go down this road and saying, we need to know where that stone comes from, good luck.
Well, you're raising something that I think is absolutely critical, and hopefully a subject that we will wade into in subsequent editions, if you will, because the challenge of smaller producers is enormous. And there's also, I mean, not to throw a monkey wrench in, but what if there is a mine that is, say, proximate to one in a given place, and the attributes of the stone are quite similar? Then that creates a muddiness with the attribute. It could create a muddiness with attribution. And I think that some of these questions are really central questions for our time, because there are so many producers that are of the scale you're suggesting, and a world, in effect, that requires a greater approach to equity and value derived, and finding a way to do that in an appropriately. And I think all of you are involved in that. So I look forward to picking up that baton. And I don't think that we will solve it in a day, but to go back, for sure, but to go back to a conversation yesterday, the goal is continuous improvement. We are not perfect. We strive for better. Thank you all for coming. It's a huge topic. There's a lot to discuss, and we hope that you love your gemstones and that perhaps this conversation has added a dimension or two to your thinking about them. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.